Hey everybody, this is Minion Soldier, and today we're talking about the Drake Buccaneer, a ship that might actually be a little bit older than you know, and the first true pirate fighter in the Star Citizen universe. Now, a lot of people believe that the Drake Buccaneer came about directly as a result of the Cutlass controversy, and that this ship right here is the real reason why the Drake Buccaneer exists. But truthfully, the Drake Buccaneer has been around since the very earliest stages of Star Citizen's development, though only in name. Originally, the Cutlass was intended to be the nimble pirate fighter that could also carry cargo, weapons, troops, that sort of thing. And in lore, it was originally offered as part of a Volksfighter or People's Fighter program in the year 2845, I believe, in the lore. And so, that bid having failed, they decided to sell it for civilian use, and that's how Drake really made its name in the industry. Now, while the Cutlass was beginning its slow march towards becoming flight ready all the way back in the Arena Commander days, the first mention of the Buccaneer goes back to this article here from, I believe, April the 25th, 2013. Now, in it, there is a write-up from a writer's guide about all the different starship manufacturers, and in there is Drake Interplanetary, and it names off 4 Drake ships: the Cutlass, the Buccaneer, the Privateer, and the Marauder. Though, out of those 4, only 2 would later emerge. Now, of course, the Cutlass was more or less guaranteed, as it was part of the Pirate Pack and one of the original ships that you could pledge for way back in the day. And so that was kind of set in stone, but the other ships, the Privateer and the Marauder, probably the Privateer ended up becoming the Caterpillar, and as for the Marauder, who knows. But the Buccaneer was a name that stuck because it got a second mention a year later. In a write-up of the Drake Company from January the 8th, 2014, they detailed a little bit more about the Drake Company, and in it they mentioned the Cutlass, the Caterpillar, and the Buccaneer again. So the Buccaneer was a name that had really stuck with them, and they still hadn't found a use for it yet. In the interim, of course, the Drake Herald finally came into existence, and the Cutlass went on to become flight ready, and the name Buccaneer and any mention of it seemed to have died off. In fact, it was bringing the Cutlass to flight ready that in the end would lay the seeds for the return of the Buccaneer name, because the Cutlass, as it became an actual ship that you could fly in Arena Commander, was far too big and far too bulky to be the nimble pirate fighter it had originally been sold as. Now, the Cutlass presented a whole series of problems. It wasn't living up to the original write-up of the ship, but at the same time, it had still kind of become its own thing, and that wasn't exactly a terrible ship. The problem with the Cutlass really is that there were 3 camps arguing over the fate of the Cutlass. There was, of course, CIG. There were the early adopters, the ones who had bought the Cutlass right in the beginning, who wanted the nimble pirate fighter that they had been promised. And there were the late adopters like myself, who had purchased the Cutlass and kind of fell in love with the ship that it had become and saw the potential there, whereas the only other alternative was the Freelancer, which had a very limited cockpit view, versus the Cutlass, which had a wide open and excellent cockpit view, and preferred the Cutlass over the Freelancer for that reason, and for other reasons going along with it being a Drake ship and therefore kind of an outlaw criminal ship. In the end, though, ultimately, it was the early adopters who were correct. I mean, basically, you can't sell somebody a sports car and then show up with a station wagon. It just doesn't work that way. And so, realistically, there was a big problem with the Cutlass. Eventually, tensions rose to a breaking point, and things on the forums got a little more than aggressive. Eventually, the Cutlass thread became known as probably one of the more toxic threads in the entire ship forum, and things kind of got a little out of hand. CIG would later propose a two-part solution. The Cutlass itself would get a rework, and as an alternative, a nimble pirate Drake fighter would be developed under the name Buccaneer. This really seemed to calm things down, and CIG went away to immediately begin work on the new concept for the Drake Buccaneer. CIG included with the ship some ideas that they had been throwing around. The ability to carry cargo like the original pirate fighter was supposed to, possibly multiple crew members. The ability to have smuggling spaces within the ship, a gun rack, so that once you arrived at your destination, you would have a selection of weapons with which to do whatever you had to do. But they also went out and elicited opinions and suggestions from the community in the Drake Ship subforum. It was at this point in that thread that a terrible YouTuber named Minion something or other created a video suggesting using an attack helicopter as the format for the new fighter. Taking something like the Huey Cobra, creating a two-man tandem cockpit, which would pretty much fit into the Drake overall look and feel of ships, but would also create opportunities with some modifications. Now, by taking the tail, raising it up, you could create a space underneath to store cargo and or weapons. A tandem cockpit would allow two people to travel within the ship, so you could do boarding operations with it, theoretically. And it offered a lot of interesting opportunities. The winglets could carry multiple different types of weapons. The gun in the front could be directed by either the pilot or a gunner, depending on the situation. And the landing skids, well, they simply offered a cheap, low-tech solution to the deployable landing gear, which oftentimes uses up a lot of space when it retracts into the ship, which could be used for other things. Now, as the Buccaneer was developed, it's important to acknowledge one thing, is that the original versions of the Buccaneer, as seen here, were all two-man cockpits. It had a very attack helicopter-like design, and it looked really good. It looked like the original concepts were very promising, and even as the concept evolved into the future towards the Buccaneer that we have now, it was extremely similar to the current Buccaneer, except it was a two-man cockpit. Ultimately, though, that design would be dropped. One of the reasons that the two-man cockpit was ultimately abandoned was because it used up a lot of space in the design that CIG wanted to use for other things. In later concept images, it referred to the lost second seat as repurposed space, and many people theory crafted that this would be used for the smuggling or the cargo or the gun rack. Since most of this development happened behind closed doors and many of the fans never got to see it, few people realized what had been lost during that initial phase of the design. Now, on June 5th of 2016, the Drake Buccaneer concept sale arrived, and it showcased a variety of weapons and equipment that the Drake Buccaneer could carry. It also was going to be, once again, a cheap pirate fighter, easily maintained in the field. It was going to fulfill the original Cutlass pledge in many areas, though some would ultimately be dropped in the future. One of the big promises, though, that CIG did keep when they released the Buccaneer was the fact that early on in the campaign to create the Buccaneer, CIG had promised that the Buccaneer would be a one-for-one trade with the Cutlass. If you owned a Cutlass, you could trade to the Buccaneer at no extra cost. When the Buccaneer was sold, however, it was sold for $10 more than the Cutlass, being $110 instead of $100. CIG sent every current owner of the Cutlass a $10 coupon to get, obviously, $10 off the price of the Buccaneer when and if they purchased it. fulfilling the original promise of the Buccaneer sail. One of the issues, sadly, that dogged the Buccaneer at the beginning of the concept sail was its weapon placement, and it kind of highlighted the disparity between mouse and keyboard controls and joystick controls. Now, initially, the weapon placement on the ship wasn't that great, and there were two possible solutions to that. Now, the initial setup seen here for a joystick user created a couple of problems. The weapon spacing was such that, depending on which weapons you were firing, a smaller ship could fly in between those weapons and not get hit, or you could alternately be hitting a ship with only one weapon instead of both, especially with the wingtip cannons, thereby creating a situation where you were either wasting ammunition or generating heat and expending energy for little or no gain. One possible solution, as seen here, was to create a system in the game whereby guns automatically adjusted for range and aimed to fire at one central point altogether, and then it was up to the pilot to then put the pipper on the target to successfully hit the other ship. This would have gone a certain distance to bridge that gap between mouse and keyboard controls, but automated guns were something that CIG kind of wanted to avoid all along. Now, a third possible solution was to take the belly cannons off the belly of the ship, place them on the back, and then take the wingtip cannons and place them underneath the nose. Move the missile pods out to the outside of the engine and move those guns to the inside of the wing, in between the engine and the main hull of the ship. This would create a tighter firing pattern, and if a pilot wanted to use separate weapons, they still could, but if they wanted to use all 6 weapons on one target at once, they would have to choose weapons that had matched projectile velocities in order to fire all those guns at the same point. So that would, in the end, give you the benefits of being able to configure your ship multiple ways and use different weapons for different purposes, but at a certain cost and a certain added layer of complexity. You could, in fact, engage with all 6 weapons at once and get that added accuracy in your fire that the initial layout did not provide. Now, the Buccaneer was also in a rush to get out the door. CIG wanted to show the work being done. They wanted people to see the wheels of the machine turning, essentially. And since they were already working on the Caterpillar and they were about to start on the Cutlass revamp, there was going to be a lot of shared assets, a lot of design language, a lot of common work that they could share between those ships. So it was very advantageous to use this window of opportunity to get the Buccaneer out the door. And for most ships, it was kind of surprising to see it developing so quickly, though they did show us some of the changes that they wanted to make and why to the Buccaneer's design.
And some of the changes that we're going to be making when we move into the actual full production of the ship is the wings. They have a very particular shape, which we're going to sort of make them a little bit smaller, a little bit sleeker to emphasize speed even more. And we're also going to be placing maneuvering thrusters all around the main engines in order to give it the maneuverability that it needs to basically outmaneuver a lot of the other heavy-hitting ships like the Hornet or the Super Hornet, which are essentially flying tanks. But this one will be a little bit more maneuverable. It just will not be able to take the hits. So with the Buccaneer, you're going to want to get in, do your damage, and try to avoid taking any damage. From a design standpoint, we also wanted the main gimbaled weapon on the belly of the ship to be usable at almost every stage of flight. So this includes having the landing gear deployed. And in its current stage in the concept, the landing gear is sort of blocking the firing arc of the gun on the bottom. So we're going to end up having to redesign the landing gears entirely for a couple of reasons. One, to give the gun the firing arc that it requires, and 2, for performance reasons. We're trying really hard to make sure that all the landing gear tucks into the ship, so that way we can call that out in the game, so it's not eating up the resources the entire time in flight.
Now, after having seen that, the community reiterated the suggestion of why not simply put the guns on the belly of the ship onto the back of it. And ultimately, CIG would do that, though it would be a couple of months later. However, a lot of the other concerns that the community had shared were simply not taken. The ship was on its way out the door, and it was going to get there as quickly as possible. Now, one of the other things that was spoken of in that video was internalizing the landing gear, therefore making it easier to run the game, less resources required, which is entirely legitimate. I mean, obviously, Star Citizen is going to be a very resource-intensive game, and so anywhere that you can save, precious CPU or GPU cycles, the better. However, internalizing the landing gear also uses up a lot of internal volume. And this was going to impact the overall ability for this ship to possibly carry cargo, have smuggling spaces, or carry extra weapons. Things that had been suggested, not explicitly promised, but suggested earlier in the development of the ship, which were now being culled to make way for, once again, internalized landing gear, not just a performance increase, but to free up the belly guns, as it were. Now, at this point, there was a lot of players who kind of felt that these features that had been suggested to go along with the ship, that gave it kind of a utilitarian nature, the extra little bit of cargo, the ability to carry weapons, a lot of these features, as they were being culled out of the design, they seemed to take away from the overall, spirit of the ship. As a lot of people were kind of feeling a little uneasy with the ship at this point, because it seemed like a lot was being lost. In the end, the landing gear that was put on the ship did eat up a lot of internal volume. Ultimately, in the winter of 2017, with patch 262, the Drake Buccaneer would arrive in game and be a flyable ship. Now, of course, some sacrifices were made along the way, but what was delivered hit a lot of the marks that the Drake Buccaneer was supposed to have hit. It was indeed fragile from certain angles, though some fixes would need to be made. It was hard-hitting. It had variable armaments. It was certainly maneuverable and certainly fast. And so it did tick a lot of the important boxes that people felt that the Drake Buccaneer should tick, though some of the personality was lost along the way, truth be told. Now, Matt Sherman did say after the release of the ship in the shipyard forums that they are open to revisiting some of these things in the future. And so if you have any suggestions, ideas, or comments, of course, that's the place for them. But try to keep it friendly. Anyways, this has been a not-so-brief look at the Drake Buccaneer, its history, and its development within CIG. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.